Day. I make this programme directly after President Biden has returned to the United States and has delivered an address to the American people, which was supposed to be connected to the events in the Middle East. A crisis, an enormous crisis, one which certainly deserved and required a statement to the American people from the US President, especially given the fact that he has just gone to the Middle East. Well, as I discussed in my programme yesterday, and indeed my previous programme, my own view is that the President's visit to the Middle East only managed to make a bad situation worse. He came to the Middle East with no constructive proposals. Apparently, the best that he could come up with was a suggestion that the traffic point, the entrance, the transit place between Gaza and Egypt be opened, with lots of suggestions that this was principally intended to enable the population of Gaza to leave Gaza and enter Egypt to facilitate Israel's military operation in Gaza, an idea which, if it was ever seriously made, the Arab states made absolutely clear was unacceptable to them and is a red light to them. Anyway, it seems to me that that is what American diplomats and American officials, and perhaps the President himself, either were suggesting or were going to suggest. And of course, given the history of the Middle East, given the fact that displacement of populations is acknowledged to be a violation, a profoundly serious violation of international humanitarian law, it was of course rejected, and of course it turned Arab opinion strongly against him. The President himself, in fairness, says that his major objective was to get the crossing points between Egypt and Gaza opened in order to allow humanitarian relief aid to enter Gaza. And in his broadcast to the American people and in other comments, he has suggested that this was something that he was able to achieve over the course of his visit. Well, all I can say is that my understanding is that as of the time of making this programme, there are still disagreements between the Egyptian authorities and the Israeli authorities, and the crossing points remain closed, and the humanitarian assistance has yet to reach the people of Gaza. In the meantime, the bombing of Gaza by the Israeli Air Force continues, and of course Hamas and the allied Islamic fighters who fight alongside Hamas in Gaza, they continue to launch rockets into Israel. And every day more people die, much more destruction is done, and given the power of the Israeli Air Force, and without in any way taking or detracting from the seriousness of what was done by Hamas fighters on the 7th of October, when they wantonly and brutally murdered Israeli civilians. Well, without detracting from that, it is now the case, indisputably, that it is civilians in Gaza who are now the civilians who are predominantly dying. And with humanitarian relief supplies unable to enter Gaza, at least for the time being, and with power and food and apparently water supplies either still blocked from reaching Gaza or reaching Gaza but only sporadically, with the Israeli authorities, as I understand it, sometimes turning on the tap and sometimes turning it off. Well, the prospects of a humanitarian crisis in Gaza increase, and given the effect of cutting off food, electricity and water to a population numbering more than 2 million people, the effect of that, if it is persisted in for many more days, will be absolutely catastrophic, and I would add catastrophic in a way that will dominate attention across the world. So that was the situation that the president found in the Middle East, and of course when he went to Israel, I don't get the impression that he did much of anything to change it. He made his usual observations, the usual observations that he's made in the past about the need for a Palestinian state, a solution of the plight of the Palestinians. He's spoken about the pain that the Palestinians suffer, about not blaming all Palestinians for the actions of Hamas. But it struck me that none of this, coming from him, went beyond words. And, of course, it proved completely inadequate for the presidents of Egypt and of the Palestinian Authority and for the King of Jordan, and therefore they called off the summit meeting that President Biden was expected to have with them in Amman. And I've discussed in my previous program how astonishing a fact that is, how unique it is for something like that to happen to the President of the United States. Anyway, apart from that, it's also clear that other Arab states, the Gulf states, Saudi Arabia, countries where in the past a US president could have been sure of a warm reception, well, apparently they weren't keen to meet with the president either. And then he went back to the United States and he delivered his address to the American people. And I have to say that it seemed to me that just as his journey to the Middle East not only did not make the situation better, in my opinion, it made it worse, because in a situation where no step is being taken by the United States, which is the one country that still exercises the greatest influence, especially over Israel, no step is being taken by the United States to calm or de-escalate the crisis or to find some kind of off-ramp, so that some kind of ceasefire or pause can be found. Well, in my opinion, just as his trip to the Middle East made things worse, because he did none of those things about really trying to exercise restraint on the part of Israel and the other parties and look for a way to calm the situation while he was in the Middle East. So, in his speech to the American people, his address to the American people from the Oval Office, he did exactly the same thing. The speech, as far as I was concerned, was just a further recitation of old, tired cliches about the United States being an indispensable country, about Hamas and the fact that it is evil, about the need for a solution to the Palestinian issue without offering anything that might lead one to think that he has any idea about how to work towards a solution. He had absolutely nothing new or interesting or important to say. And then, incredibly, as he spoke about this crisis, this extremely dangerous and escalating crisis, in hackneyed and cliched terms. He switched to what I suspect remains his main interest, perhaps even his obsession, which is the conflict with Russia in Ukraine. He made observations about President Putin. He spoke about President Putin of Russia in the most insulting way. He criticized Russia's actions in Ukraine. He spoke about Ukraine, as far as I could see, even more than he spoke about the situation in the Middle East. And he ended it all with a request from Congress for authorization of $100 billion in aid, of which $60 billion is to be provided to Ukraine and $14 billion is to be provided to Israel. He spoke, in other words, in the midst of a tremendous crisis in the Middle East, giving more emphasis to the conflict in Ukraine, which fewer and fewer Americans care about or want their country to be involved in. He placed more emphasis on that, demanded more funding for it than he did over the crisis that is absorbing attention, not just in the Middle East, but also in the United States and around the world. He showed less interest in that crisis in the Middle East than in his own obsession over Ukraine. I have to say, I've listened to many presidential addresses in the past. I can remember addresses from the Oval Office made by President Nixon at the time of the Vietnam War. And I have never seen or heard anything quite like this, one which seemed to me to fail so completely to rise to the gravity of the situation, to grapple with its underlying problems, to chart a way forward as this one. And just as President Biden's journey to the Middle East, which ultimately became just a journey to Israel, in my opinion, has ended up making a bad situation there even worse, so I get the sense that this speech has done the same. I think most people in the Middle East will have concluded from this speech that despite various words that we've been hearing about how President Biden has counselled restraint upon Israel, to all intents and purposes, and in reality, he has given the Netanyahu government carte blanche to do whatever it wants or considers it needs to do in this conflict. An astonishing position, committing President Biden's own prestige to Prime Minister Netanyahu, all the more so given that an opinion poll in Israel, which I have just been reading in the Daily Telegraph, apparently shows that 80% of Israelis consider that Prime Minister Netanyahu was responsible for the original incursion by Hamas into Israel on the 7th of October, and that includes 69% of supporters, people who vote for Likud, the party that Prime Minister Netanyahu leads. So it's astonishing, it seems to me, for the president to link his fortunes to a man, Prime Minister Netanyahu, a political leader who is now becoming unpopular and discredited in Israel itself. And I have to say, once again, that this extraordinary obsession with Ukraine and this, also it seemed to me, lack of focus on the crisis in the Middle East, what makes it even more bizarre to me is that apparently American citizens have been amongst those killed, and American citizens have been amongst those taken prisoner and held hostage by Hamas. And one would have thought that the President of the United States would be focused especially on obtaining their safety and freedom. Anyway, as I said, most people in the Middle East will see this speech as giving Israel carte blanche, and other things that have happened over the course of the last few hours will have reinforced that view. Firstly, President Biden's administration is now resisting calls from within his own Democratic Party for the United States to back an independent investigation of the hospital bombing or missile strike or whatever it was in Gaza. Now, let me say again, I've been getting a deluge of comments from many people about this particular hospital strike. Several people have referred me, for example, to a program done by Al Jazeera, which provides a minute-by-minute commentary of airstrikes or supposed airstrikes by Israel, and apparently discusses the Israeli interception of a Hamas or Islamic Jihad rocket, which is supposed to have been the rocket that people say might have fallen on the hospital. This Al Jazeera program seems to cast doubt on that. I have seen these programs. I've read everything that I think is relevant on this topic. I still maintain that there is nowhere near enough information to come to a definitive conclusion as to what happened. An independent investigation is, to my mind, the only way of doing it. And an independent investigation conceivably might even be possible. It is not as if the United Nations is not present on the ground in Gaza. It is not as if other agencies like the International Committee for the Red Cross also do not have their own people in Gaza. In other words, Western agencies or United Nations agencies or international agencies do already have a presence in Gaza. It is not territory that is completely off limits. And my own view is that if there was a call for an independent investigation of this incident from the United States, a Security Council resolution, a UN Security Council resolution calling for such an investigation would be certainly possible and could take place, and we would probably get close to the truth and might even find out the truth. Well, President Biden's administration has rejected pressure upon it to call for an independent investigation. Now, put aside whatever motives it might actually have for this decision. In the Middle East, in the Arab world, amongst Muslims, amongst most of the global community, This step will be seen as providing cover to Israel and will of course reinforce the belief that it was an Israeli bomb or missile strike that caused the deaths and the damage in the hospital. So again, it seems to me a bizarre, unforced error, and one wonders why exactly the US administration, the Biden administration, should be so anxious in avoiding an independent investigation of an incident like this. Does it really want to cover for Israel? Is that actually its purpose? If so, why? Given that, in fact, it would be covering less for Israel than for Prime Minister Netanyahu, who, as I said, even the bulk of Israelis have turned against, as that opinion poll in Israel apparently shows. Anyway, that was one step that the US government has taken. But of course, we have had that vote in the UN Security Council. And this is the vote on the draft resolution proposed by Brazil. Now, I discussed it at some length over the course of my programme yesterday. But I'm going to return to this subject today because I understand that I now realise that there were things that I said yesterday that were either factually wrong in one case or which did not fully capture the essence of what happened. Now, firstly, discussing what went wrong, what I said which was wrong. Over the course of my programme yesterday, I said that Russia had supported the resolution. In fact, Russia was one of the two countries which abstained. The other country which abstained was, of course, Britain. The United States voted against. It was the only country to vote against the resolution. And, in fact, it is not at all difficult to understand what has gone on, what went on. Now, I've discussed how moves made in the UN Security Council over the course of a crisis of this nature have something about them of the quality of a chess game. And I should say that one person who is particularly adept at this chess game in the UN Security Council and who has deep knowledge of its procedures and of the way that the Security Council works is none other than Russia's Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov, who before he was appointed Foreign Minister was Russia's ambassador to the UN and who therefore worked a long time at the Security Council. So Lavrov is somebody who understands the UN Security Council, who has a direct experience of it, who knows how it works, of how to pull the right strings, and how in the UN Security Council to get things done. Now, I'm not suggesting here that he is the sole puppet master. I just want to make the point, I'm just making the point, that when it comes to acting in the Security Council, the Russians are very experienced and they know what they're doing. So, it's not difficult to see what happened. The Russians prepare their draft resolution. It calls for a ceasefire, humanitarian relief to be allowed into Gaza, and for the release of hostages. It does not contain any condemnation of Hamas. The Russians say that they omitted from the text of their resolution condemnation of Hamas because they wanted a depoliticized resolution that nobody could take objections to, that it would be simply a resolution setting out certain practical steps without causing deeper polarisation, deeper argument within the Council about assigning responsibilities. Now, when they did that, the Russians will surely have known that the United States would seize on the fact that the resolution did not condemn Hamas as its grounds for opposing the resolution. And that is exactly what the United States and its allies all did. They opposed the resolution, the Russian drafted resolution, saying that they were doing so because the resolution did not contain any words critical of Hamas. So the next day, the Russians stepped back and allowed their BRICS partner, Brazil, to put forward their draft resolution. And in its essentials, the Brazilian draft resolution was identical to the Russian. It also called for a ceasefire, humanitarian relief to the people of Gaza, and the release of hostages. But unlike the Russian-sponsored resolution, it contained words condemning Hamas. Now, that appeared to satisfy the objections that the United States had made on the previous day, when the United States voted down the draft resolution proposed by Russia. So, what does the United States do? Well, it vetoes the resolution. It vetoes the resolution even though the text of the resolution appears to satisfy American concerns, and the Russians, undoubtedly by agreement with the Brazilians, made it easier for the US to vote for the resolution by abstaining on it. This was clearly something that the Brazilians and the Russians agreed with each other. Each agreed that the other would propose their own draft resolutions. The Russians would go first, the Brazilians would follow. Each of these countries would abstain on the resolution proposed by the other, all with a view to make it easier for the Western powers and for the United States to support the resolution. Both the Brazilians and, of course, especially the Russians would have known that the United States, in reality, would veto the resolution. And that, of course, is precisely what the United States did. So, in effect, the United States has ended up vetoing a resolution which satisfied the main objection it had to an earlier resolution proposed by Russia on the previous day. The optics of this are disastrous, and when you read the text of the comments that the US ambassador made when she voted against the resolution, you sense how defensive she felt, and you see how incoherent her statements were. The optics of this, once again, are terrible. The United States, at a time of deepening crisis in the Middle East, is opposing a ceasefire, is opening the way for military action by Israel, and appears to be covering for Israel, or to be more precise, for the Netanyahu government as it prepares to take whatever action it is that it intends to take. Unsurprisingly, President Mahmoud Abbas, the president of the Palestinian Authority, has again, apparently, refused to take a call from President Biden. Well, it's not just, of course, that the diplomacy has been maladroit, to put it mildly. The United States has deployed enormous military forces to the Middle East, or is in the process of doing so. There is already one carrier group operating in the Eastern Mediterranean, not far from the Lebanese coast. The United States is said to be in the process of deploying a second carrier group to the same area. Yesterday, a US Navy destroyer intercepted and destroyed missiles, cruise missiles launched from Yemen, presumably by the Houthis, towards Israel. The United States, the administration, the president have at various times suggested that the United States is not looking to become directly involved in military terms in this conflict, and yet by shooting down these missiles, arguably it has taken the first step now to involve itself in the fighting, and of course it is doing so on the side of Israel. And the United States is adding to the tension by calling upon all of its citizens to leave the Middle East, by apparently reducing the staff at its embassies. All of these, perhaps, given the collapse of diplomacy that we have seen, are proper precautions. But of course, they heighten the sense of crisis and the feeling that the whole situation is spiralling out of control. I am unable to see what exactly the strategy is here. A couple of days ago, we were getting reports from the United States that American officials were unable to see a coherent plan behind Israel's actions. That may be true, and probably is true, but it is at least equally true of the current administration in the United States. To the extent that they appear to have any sort of plan, it is to back Prime Minister Netanyahu in whatever it is that he's going to do and hope for the best. That's all I can see that they are prepared to do. Anyway, in the meantime, the security situation continues to deteriorate. As I said, the fighting continues. The bomb strikes on Gaza continue. There's reports this morning of Orthodox churches in Gaza being destroyed. And of course, civilians are dying in large numbers. And missiles, of course, also falling on Israel, launched from Gaza. But now there are also reports of attacks on American military installations, the American base in Syria, established in Syria without the permission of the Syrian government or the authorization of the Arab League or of the UN Security Council. Anyway, that base at Al-Tanf has now come under attack. So apparently have positions in Syria also occupied by US soldiers. It's not clear to me yet who is behind these attacks, but they are happening, and apparently some American soldiers have been wounded, though thankfully none up to this point have been killed. And there are reports that in Iraq, various Iraqi militia groups are also now announcing their intention to attack US bases in Iraq. So, a generally escalating situation, a Middle East that is becoming increasingly unsettled and angry, a spiral of violence and no real step by the administration to bring the situation under control, even whilst the president remains fixated with the issue of Ukraine and the conflict with Russia. Now, yesterday, I discussed at some length the fact that that President Putin has spoken about the fact that the Russians are now patrolling the Black Sea with their MiG-31 fighter jets, and President Putin pointedly reminding everyone that these MiG-31 fighter jets are also the launch carriers of the hypersonic Kinzhal missiles, and that these Kinzhal missiles have a range of around over 1,000 kilometers, so that they could, in theory, reach US carrier groups operating in the Eastern Mediterranean. Now, President Putin was very careful to say that this was a warning and not a threat. But then I did wonder why President Putin would feel the need to give such a warning. And I think after President Biden's address, it's actually become clearer, and it's a clarity which the Russians, having been obliged to first work and then deal with what this administration has been up to since he took office, this particular president has been doing since he took office, aware of his intense hostility to Russia and to President Putin in particular. Anyway, the Russians are obviously warning the United States that if by any chance these carrier groups, these American carrier groups in the Eastern Mediterranean, take military action against Russian forces in Syria, where the Russians have both an important air base and a significant military presence, and where they also have a naval base at Tartus. Anyway, the Russians are essentially giving a warning to the United States that if there is any attack on these Russian bases in Syria, if the United States launches airstrikes or other missile strikes against these bases, perhaps with these carrier groups, then Russia is in a position to retaliate, and it can launch hypersonic missiles against American carriers and other American warships. And of course, at that point, should these disastrous outcomes ever happen, well, we will be dangerously close to World War III. So we see the extraordinarily dangerous situation that is developing in the Middle East. We see how President Biden, both by his visit to Israel and by his subsequent speech in the Oval Office, has only managed to make the situation worse. Over the course of his speech, President Biden said that one of the reasons why it was important to help Ukraine fight the Russians in Ukraine was so that American soldiers don't have to fight the Russians in Europe. The reality is that we are now closer to an out-and-out engagement between the Russians and the Americans than I can ever remember in my lifetime. One has to go back to the Cuban Missile Crisis to see a situation more dangerous than this one, we have a situation where there are American carrier groups in the Eastern Mediterranean, dispatched there by the President of the United States, and the President of Russia sees that as a direct threat to Russian troops in Syria and is giving warnings that if those troops are attacked by those carrier groups, then Russia is in a position to undertake military retaliation. The danger of a clash with Russia, which President Biden says his policy in Ukraine is intended to prevent, is actually becoming ever more real, driven now by President Biden's policies in the Middle East. Well, there we are. There's an awful lot more happening. There's continued waiting on what the Israelis are going to do, what the Israeli government is going to do. There's more and more talk from Israeli officials about some kind of ground offensive by Israel against Gaza. This has been talked about now for many days. It hasn't yet happened. Many military specialists and advisors have advised against it. I am one. I'm not a military person, but I also think it is unwise, and I fear it could go horribly wrong. But anyway, it's become even more clear to me now that that is coming and that there is absolutely nothing that can prevent it. I'm going to say this. I think that despite these extraordinary dangers, the worst, an all-out war in the Middle East, a crisis of unimaginable dimensions, is probably going to be avoided. I think that none of the parties want to see it happen, and I think that in the end, the forces of restraint will prevent it from happening. I say that even as I'm making this program, I've seen reports of Iran moving its long-range missiles towards their launch points. In other words, Iran taking its own steps, perhaps considering possible action against Israel in the event that there is a ground offensive. But I think that in the end, probably we will see a pulling back from the worst, even though the fighting is certain to intensify, and even though that fighting has every chance of becoming extremely protracted and very violent. But I also think that at some point the pressure, not from the global south, as Professor Sachs has often said, Jeffrey Sachs has often said, that is really not a proper use of language, from the global majority will increase to the point where calls for a ceasefire become overwhelming. And we've already seen how the United States has been outmaneuvered by the Russians and the Brazilians on the Security Council, how it has been left to vote against a Brazilian resolution all by itself, with even allies like France and Albania supporting the resolution. And that pressure, if the fighting does become protracted and violent, as I fear, and as the humanitarian crisis in Gaza develops, that pressure for a ceasefire will increase. And it won't just be in the global majority outside the collective West that pressure is going to grow. Already there have been protests in Europe, there have been protests in Britain, and there's starting to be protests in the United States, including one that also involved a trespass into the Capitol, I understand, by a Jewish anti-war group. So, public opinion in the West will also turn, and that will, in time, increase the pressure on Western governments and will make it very difficult, even for the United States, to go on vetoing resolutions calling for ceasefires as they continue to be put forward. And when that resolution, which calls for a ceasefire, is eventually passed, obviously it will be seen as having been passed despite the opposition of the United States, and if a ceasefire is achieved, it will be despite the United States and not because of it. And that will deepen the debacle that the United States will have experienced in the Middle East, and it will have moved forward significantly, moved the dial forward significantly towards the ultimate objective of the BRICS countries, set out now quite clearly by China's Foreign Minister Wang Yi, for the negotiations to achieve a sustained, long-term, definite settlement of this crisis to take place, no longer through the mediation efforts of the United States, but by the vehicle of an international conference in which many, many more countries, including, of course, China and Russia, will also be involved. So, that, I think, ultimately is where events are going. Now, there are, of course, possibilities. It could be, as I've said, that Hamas, its fighters, turn out to be a lot less effective in resisting the Israelis than most people expect, and that is a possibility. And alternatively, it could be that we do get that uncontrolled escalation, in which case I'm not going to even try now and imagine what the consequences of that are going to be. But that, it seems to me, is where we're heading. The United States is already becoming isolated. Its role in Middle East diplomacy is being rejected, and of course all that looks set to continue. Moreover, if this affair ends in the kind of debacle that I suspect, then, as was pointed out to me in a meeting I had yesterday with two people who are extremely familiar with the situation in the Middle East, but who I'm not going to say more about on this programme. Anyway, as was pointed out to me, that could serve as an important catalyst for people in the United States and Europe to doubt other aspects of the administration's foreign policy, including its foreign policy towards Russia and in connection with Ukraine. As credibility, as the administration's credibility collapses in connection with offence in the Middle East, it's difficult to believe that its credibility will hold up in connection with events in Ukraine. So, a disastrous trip by the President to the Middle East, a disastrous speech by the President to the American people, both taking a bad crisis and making it much worse, and setting the scene, eventually, for what could turn out, and most likely will turn out, to be a major diplomatic debacle. Anyway, as I say many times, the crisis in the Middle East is not the only crisis. There is continued conflict, there is continued war in Ukraine. And as I make this programme, there are reports that President Putin of Russia has just visited the headquarters of the Russian command in overall charge of the forces that are fighting in this war in Rostov-on-Don, and he's had a meeting there with the overall commander, General Valery Gerasimov, who is of course also the Chief of General Staff of the Russian Armed Forces. And most Russian commentaries agree that Gerasimov will have briefed Putin about the overall plans that the Russian military has, and incidentally, increasing numbers of Russian officials are speaking about plans. There clearly is some sort of a plan, no longer denied. That's no longer denied or on the part of military officials. But they also think, Russian commentaries also think, that Gerasimov and the military commanders are specifically briefing Putin about the situation in Avdeyevka. And all of the evidence suggests that Avdeyevka has now become the main point of fighting, and it seems that an important person on the Ukrainian side thinks so as well, because there are also reports today that General Zaluzhny, the overall military commander of the Ukrainian armed forces, has also been to Avdeyevka to assess and be briefed about the situation by the commanders on the spot. Now, there's been lots of discussion and talk about what exactly is going on in the fighting in Avdeyevka. A couple of days ago, there were all sorts of claims in the Western media, originating, it must be said, from Ukraine, that the Russian offensive had been a catastrophic misfire, that hundreds of Russian tanks and had been destroyed and thousands of Russian troops had been killed. I was sceptical about those claims then, and to be frank, I don't take them seriously any longer. Now, it's difficult to get an exact picture of what precisely is going on, but my sense is that the Russians not only are making progress, but they are making significant progress. Apparently, they've now captured another strategic position called the slag heap, whatever that is, and they're advancing, they're taking more fortified positions previously controlled by Ukraine. The fighting is extremely difficult and very bitter, but the Russians are apparently bringing overwhelming firepower in terms of artillery and aircraft to bear. And I come back to that email sent to me many months ago by a member of the Duran community with a background which includes the Indian Armed Forces, I'm not going to say more, who pointed out that the most effective way to destroy fortifications, heavy fortifications, is not through shelling, but through bombing with heavy bombs. And apparently that is increasingly what the Russians have been doing around Avdeyevka. And of course, Russian bombs have become more precise. They're now precision guided, but apparently the precision guided equipment has improved and they're becoming heavier. So whereas previously we had 500 kilo and 250 kilo bombs, Russian aircraft are now operating with 1,500 kilo bombs. And by the way, and incidentally, I also remember seeing pictures of the Russian Defense Minister Sergei Shoigu touring a factory where these bombs were being made, and in the background there were massive bombs, enormous bombs, which commentators said were 9,000 kilo bombs, 9-ton bombs, which of course would pack an absolutely devastating punch if they were used in action in Ukraine. They haven't been used so far. So anyway, reports about fighting in Avdeyevka continue, and I've also read a report, I think it was in Slavyangrad, that the actual distance between the two pincers, the one in the north and the one in the south, is 8 to 9 kilometers. So if one thinks about what that means, if the pincer from the north moves towards the pincer in the south by, say, 2 kilometers, and the pincer in the south moves towards the pincer in the north also by 2 kilometers, then the funnel through which Ukrainian reinforcements have to pass if they are to enter Avdeyevka shrinks by half. Now, that may not sound like very much, 2 kilometers, but of course this is an intensely, bitterly fought area, heavily fortified, and the Ukrainians will be doing everything they possibly can to prevent that from happening. There's been further news, however, over the last 24 hours, which highlights one of their biggest problems, because there was a report in Axios which says that the United States is now being pressed by Israel to provide 155mm shells to Israel to support Israel's offensive in Gaza. As discussed many times in many programs, the United States is already running critically short of these shells and cannot meet Ukrainian needs for these shells out of its production. So, already there is a shortage of these shells, but Axios says that the United States has been obliged, because there is really no political alternative to doing this, to prioritize supply of shells to Israel over Ukraine. So Ukraine, which is already suffering from a shell shortage, is likely to suffer soon from an even greater shell shortage, as the Russians apparently increase bombardments on Ukrainian defense positions in Avdiivka, even as the Ukrainians run short of shells themselves. Having said this, no Russian commentator that I know expects this battle for Avdeyevka to end anytime soon. And I want to repeat that, and Russian commentators who talk about the overall state of the war, they expect it to continue for many months, perhaps more, a year, perhaps longer than that, before it finally comes to a conclusion. But I think I'm reporting things accurately now when I say that no Russian official, no Russian commentator any longer seriously doubts that this conflict is going to end with a Russian victory. Anyway, that's the situation in Avdeyevka. Russian advances, an operational crisis for Ukraine, calling for General Zaluzhny's urgent visit to the battlefronts, and by the way, to reports of Ukraine redeploying reinforcements to the area of Avdeyevka in order to plug the gaps. There's also been reports of Ukraine attempting some kind of offensive of its own, and this is that long discussed, tantalizing offensive across the Dnieper River into the area of Kherson region still controlled by the Russians on the East Bank. Now, I've discussed this in recent videos. I've said that up to this point, whatever actions the Ukrainians have been taking have appeared to me to be very underpowered. It looks like small groups of Ukrainian soldiers, presumably Marines, crossing the Dnieper on boats, using various islands to provide them with shelter along the way, landing on the eastern shore, and then trying to move towards villages or dispersing in forests to be attacked before very long by the Russians. And this is what's been happening now for several days. Up to this point, all attempts by these Ukrainian troops to capture any villages on the East Bank have been unsuccessful. There were reports yesterday that the Ukrainians have been pushed back to the East Bank, that they'd suffered very, very heavy losses. The Russians still expect more Ukrainian troops to come. This is clearly going to be something that's going to continue for some time, and we don't yet know the full extent of what it is exactly that Ukraine is going to try to do in this area. But again, I have to say I've been tracking Russian commentaries about these events, and they seem to be unanimously confident in supposing that whatever it is that the Ukrainians have in mind, the Russian troops on the East Bank of the Dnieper are more than able to handle it. And I should say that this information comes from some of the best Telegram channels in the Russian internet sphere, if I can put it that way. And in most cases, these are channels that do actually have actual connections and sources amongst Russian soldiers on the front lines, including those who are fighting on the East Bank of the Dnieper. I make that last point because I've noticed that recently some British newspapers, when discussing supposed Ukrainian victories or advances, give as apparent corroboration statements appearing to confirm those victories alleged to have been made by various Russian telegram channels, almost without exception. They're ones I've never heard of, and I'm going to say straightforwardly that I suspect that some of them, at least, are fakes. Anyway, I just wanted to say that because I know that there are a lot of fake channels around. If you want to get a sense of what are the real channels, then I would again advise anyone who's interested in that sort of thing to go to Slavyangrad, which not only publishes in English, but is a very, very good site aggregator. They provide information from Ukrainian channels, and they also provide pieces from other Russian telegram channels, only this time they are the real ones. Anyway, that's what I wanted to say. So, a battle going on along the Dnieper River. We'll have to see what ultimately it is that Ukraine has in mind. But as I said, the Russians don't seem too concerned. They seem to feel that they have the situation there under control, and the number of Ukrainian troops seems to be relatively small, but a definite operational crisis for Ukraine around Avdeyevka, and there are also scattered reports of a further emerging operational crisis for Ukraine north near to Kupiansk and around the Oskol River. Apparently, this has been developing for some time. The Russians have been taking various positions around there. They've been methodically capturing Ukrainian fortified positions in this area. And again, there's talk that the Russians are gradually working their way towards an encirclement of the Ukrainian forces in this area. Having said this, I want to stress again that the fog of war, which lies very heavily over Avdeyevka, lies even heavily over Kupiansk. So there we are. That is the state of the battle at the moment. A developing military crisis in Avdeyevka, an intrigue about what is going on in Kherson region, potentially another military crisis in Kupiansk and on the Oskol, and no sign of any diplomatic initiative by the Ukrainians, by the Western powers, by the administration at all. Instead, all the president can think of doing is trying to wangle from Congress another $60 billion to give to Ukraine without any clear idea that I can see of what it is meant to do. Now, just to finish, one of the things one often hears said, and President Biden has again said it, is that for the United States, giving money to Ukraine is a smart investment. It degrades the Russian military and prevents the Russians supposedly from advancing into Europe. From every conceivable angle, this is wrong. But if we are looking at this in purely monetary terms, if we are going to apply this rather cynical calculus that President Biden and others in the United States, including a Republican group that's lobbying for Ukraine, if we're going to follow that kind of logic, then it seems to me obvious that far from this being a wise commercial investment, sending money to Ukraine, it is just another case of throwing good money after bad. But there we are. The president remains obsessed with Ukraine. He remains obsessed with Putin, whom he mentioned several times in his speech. Perhaps when it's impossible to expect anything different And personally, I don't think we will see anything different until the administration changes. Anyway, that's me for today. The BRICS summit in Beijing has ended. This is an enormous event, in my opinion, at least as consequential as these two wars. And we will be doing a dedicated program about it on the Duran. And we've had discussions with Sofia Midkiff, who has also who is from China, who has helped us to understand much about Chinese foreign policy. But I do expect and hope and believe that I will eventually be able to turn to this topic also in this program. Meanwhile, we all wait to see what's going to happen in the Middle East, what Israel is going to do, how they're going to be used, how Prime Minister Netanyahu is going to use the carte blanche that he has apparently been given by President Biden. And on my side, I await all that with dread. Well, thank you for joining me again today. More from me soon. And in the meantime, let me remind you that you can find all our programs on our various platforms, Locals, Rumble and X. You can support our work via Patreon and Subscribestar. Links under this video. You can also check out our shop and buy yourself the wonderful things that you would find there. And last but not least, please don't forget, if you've liked this video, to tick the like button and to check your subscription to this channel. Thank you again. More from me soon. Have a very good day.